This is Heidi Moore of The Guardian, in for the vacationing Brian Lehrer. One thing I know Brian is not doing on his vacation right now is visiting a Renaissance fair. We've all heard of Renaissance fairs, even if we haven't experienced them. They set up camp outside some big cities, and you have an idea of what you'll see there. Performers walking around in heavy velvet dresses, billowy shirts, eating turkey legs, and singing while accompanied by medieval instruments. It's kind of a cross between a carnival and a historical Disneyland. But there's more behind the court gestures and the nostalgia, says Rachel Lee Rubin. She's the author of the new book, Well Met, Renaissance Fairs and the American Counterculture. And she argues that we owe the 60s, as we know them, to Renaissance fairs. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
So, okay, first I have to ask, why did you choose to study Renaissance fairs? Did they capture your imagination?
Well, it's actually somewhat of a funny story. I was at the Renaissance Fair in Massachusetts with my then 5-year-old, and along with us was a friend from England. And he was quite horrified at what he saw as the misrepresentation of English history at that fair. And I was somewhat tickled by his horror, but then I started to think it would be seriously interesting to see, to sort of think in an organized way about what use people are putting to that history as represented.
So, Rachel, what would you see at a Renaissance fair these days? How has it developed since the 1960s, when it was this counterculture movement, to today?
Well, it's changed a lot, but there are definitely some very key holdovers. There are still plenty of people who work at the fair. This is their economy, and they travel the circuit. There are different Renaissance fairs operating at different times, including, some people who don't have a permanent home outside of the trailers or the booths or the tents they sleep in at the fair. And I think that definitely developed out of the sort of 60s countercultural ideal of traveling. We all know the meaning of the Volkswagen minibus or the hippie hitchhiker. So the fair sort of, I think, the early fair encouraged this and sort of fit in with this ideal. And there are still plenty of people who do that too. They call themselves Rennies for shorthand, the fair workers, and one of them said to me, "You can't call yourself a Rennie unless you wake up at least 6 months out of the year looking at plywood," referring to the booths that they sleep in after hours. So, that sort of thing, the privileging of the handmade, people who sell crafts at the fair and who really, really care whether something is handmade instead of, mass-produced, that's definitely still there. The fairs now are, at least most of them, are owned by sort of entertainment corporations. And a lot of people who have been around since the beginning, comment that the fair has, as they say, been cleaned up considerably. There's less sort of off-color humor or less sort of strictly adult spaces than there used to be. But, but all of that is definitely still there. So, it's sort of like, it's more reliable, I think, as an income. There's a sort of stability that comes from the spread and the sort of operating as a chain. But some people do mourn the early days when it was really just sort of more of a collective project.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things in your book was that you noted that Renaissance fairs now often get mocked. You quote one blogger who calls it redneck Disneyland, and others dismiss it as mortifyingly nerdy. Why is that? Why isn't it as embraced in the mainstream as it might have been before?
Well, first of all, there have always been people, I call them haters in the sort of, the way young people speak. But there's always been a certain amount of that. There was even one year when an organized opposition got the fair shut down and said it attracted too many hippies and weirdies to the area. So this really is a straight development from that. And I think that, the reasons are, as you mentioned, class-based ridicule. Redneck Disneyland sort of sums it up, but there's a lot of that. I think another huge thing I heard about is people who are embarrassed by the idea of men in tights, as they put it, which I think, just has to do with, a fair amount of homophobia and also sort of like rigid ideas about what masculinity should look like. And then the third thing is people who are just horrified that at the fair, large women, sort of dare to show their bodies. So, and it's also celebrated for that, by the way. I've spoken to many sort of size acceptance advocates who said the fair is the first time I was ever able to feel beautiful as a woman. So, but you'll see both sides of that coin. So, I think the dismissal of the fair, as personal it might feel to people, definitely it sort of operates in these ideological ways.
Yeah, and you talk about way back in the 60s. I mean, it wasn't just the regular counterculture. It wasn't just benign hippies. You talk about the socialist and anarchist movements that really took root there, partially related to Pacific, if I understood correctly. So what is the relation of those movements, which were more extreme, to the Renaissance fair aesthetic?
Well, I think that I guess I don't know exactly what you mean by more extreme, but I would say that, definitely the Renaissance Fair provided an opportunity for people to have a sort of different kind of economy. And so for some people, this is, as I said before, sort of wanting to have a craft-based economy that sort of privileges the quirky and the handmade. But there are definitely people who wanted to have an economy that was more communal. And, people working at the fair have and still live in communal or semi-communal situations. And for some people, that would articulate itself as socialism. I think for some people would use that word, some people wouldn't use that word, but definitely people were looking for, I think they would agree that they were looking for a kind of alternative economy and finding it here. And we can live by playing music, or we can, live by selling our pottery like that.
Yeah, and, a lot of the musicians who were inspired by that Renaissance fair aesthetic, even Bob Dylan, they would have called themselves not singers, but troubadours, storytellers.
That's right, Bob Dylan, who, by the way, did turn up at the fair.
And Tom Brokaw, right?
You know, you're absolutely right, though, that use of the word minstrel that, you know, some people did in the folk revival leading up to the fair. And during, right, is a sort of reference to that period. And Dylan used it, too. You know, I don't want to be a spokesperson for my generation. I want to be a minstrel boy.
Yeah. So, Rachel, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Rachel Lee Rubin. She wrote a really interesting book called Well Met on the aesthetics of Renaissance fairs and the counterculture.